the truth. When you think you're dying, it's fine, give me me. And pop this in your brain. You do it all again, but you don't stop trying.
We demand to be equal! Hold up those torn equal cards, let everybody see them. This is what the government wants to do to trans people. Not acceptable. We will be equal in our state, we will be equal in the eyes of the law, and we will be equal citizens together. Make some noise! Thank you, everybody. Hear, hear, Carrul. This process, I remember when the GRAG report was launched in Buswell's Hotel across the road, and Joan Burton was on the panel with Lydia Foy and a few other dignitaries, and it was said in the room at the time that this report is deeply problematic and there are things that concern our entire community in this, and she was quite taken aback. But she said that this is a part of a process going forward and my door will always be open. Well, maybe she forgot to leave it ajar, but the process moved forward without proper consultation with any members of our community, and particularly no direct engagement with TENI for a very long time. And this is, I think it's reflected in what Carrul said. There is a measure of apathy that this was an autopilot process that was going to deliver some political dividends with no investment of political capital. And this is where it has brought us to now. And now she has exactly one chance left to listen to the advice that's being offered, to listen to the humanity of the calls for equality from people in the trans community, and to amend this legislation. And here to speak to us now is Michael Farrell from FLAC.
Thank you very much, Max. Thank you very much, Max. And thank you to Noise for organising this rally today, which is keeping the pressure on about this issue and keeping it in the public eye, because it's very important to do that. Now, I'm here, I suppose, because I'm the solicitor who's been representing Lydia Foy for the last almost 10 years now, and because of her struggle, which you know about. And in just over 2 weeks' time, it will be 22 years since Lydia Foy wrote to the Registrar General asking for a birth certificate to reflect her female gender and her female name. 4 years after that, with no progress made, Dr. Foy felt obliged to issue legal proceedings. And as a result, she's been in and out of the courts for the last 18 years, ending 2 weeks ago. That's a huge chunk out of Lydia Foy's life. And she has had to travel a long and lonely road with her personal life exposed to unwanted public scrutiny and frequently to ridicule and abuse. And of course, many other trans people have had to undergo their own less public but equally painful journey down the years. Now, Dr. Foy won her case 7.5 years ago in the High Court. And the judge said that Ireland was in breach of the European Convention on Human Rights. And indeed, without the European Convention, she wouldn't have won that case. Oh dear. My fingers are cold, I suppose, I can't turn the pages. But the judge who gave that judgment in Lydia Foy's case also said that Ireland was seriously isolated in the whole of Europe because it didn't have any provision for recognising the preferred gender of trans persons. The Irish government was criticised by the UN and by the Council of Europe, and still nothing happened. And good luck to you, but support trans rights as well. So anyway, criticism in breach of the European Convention, criticism by the UN, criticism by the Council of Europe, and still nothing happened until 2 years ago. Lydia Foy had to go back to the courts for the third time, and then 2 weeks ago she finally won her case. The result was the Gender Recognition Bill, which is currently before the Seanad in beside us. It's long overdue, and it's a scandal that trans people in this country have been isolated, bullied and abandoned for all that time. The state owes the trans community an apology for the way that they have been treated over the years, and especially over the last 7.5 years, since the courts put it beyond all argument that the failure to recognise them was in breach of the European Convention on Human Rights. The state also owes it to the trans community to put this right. In one way, they have an advantage. Other European countries which recognised trans people 30 years ago, with all the prejudices of that time, and so with legislation that was very restrictive, those countries are now dismantling all the restrictive and exclusionary conditions that they put in their legislation. And we, that's Free Legal Advice Centres, whom I work for, and the UCD Human Rights Network, had a meeting last week in which we had a German Supreme Court judge speaking at it, who is herself transgendered, and she was describing the situation, how Germany introduced its first gender recognition legislation in 1978, and how their constitutional court, over the succeeding 30 years, had time and again had to go back to that legislation to dismantle bits of it which excluded people. And unfortunately, we have these bits in our proposed legislation. So unfortunately, our government has the advantage that it could look at what the other countries have been doing. And having ignored the trans community for so long, the state owes it to them to learn from the experiences of other countries, to avoid their mistakes, and to put in place welcoming and inclusive legislation here. But unfortunately, that is not what is happening. Other speakers have described the flaws in this current bill, and senators from all parties, including the government parties, have argued compellingly during the discussion in the Seanad for amendments to the Gender Recognition Bill, especially in relation to the exclusion of married trans persons, the forced divorce that Victoria talked about, the lack of any provision for young trans persons who are most vulnerable to bullying and intimidation, and also to the requirement for medical certification. If the bill goes through unchanged, then these are all issues that will leave some trans people out in the cold and unprotected, and they may have to go to the courts to secure their rights. And of course, the first one up, I gather, is going to be Victoria. But it would leave them to do that. But no other trans person should have to go through the long, lonely, difficult road that Lydia Foy had to go through in order to get us to this point. Nobody should have to go through that again in order to unpick something put in this legislation. And that has already been pointed out to the government. Now, the bill will probably conclude in the Seanad next week, and it doesn't look as if there's going to be much amendment before it concludes there. But there will then be some little time before it's introduced in the Dáil. And there is still time to lobby and persuade the government to make concrete and important changes in the areas that have been highlighted here today, and there's time for them to do it. It's welcome that the government has decided to deal with this issue, though it is very late in the day for them to do so. And one would think that if they had decided that they were going to do it now, they would decide also that they should do it right. And they should make it a measure that the trans community should be able to welcome with enthusiasm instead of with disappointment. A measure about which they could rejoice in and celebrate without having to plan instead for the next court case and the next campaign to undo or to plug the holes that the government's bill will leave behind. And to finish, I'd just like to paraphrase an election slogan that some of you may remember from some years ago: a lot done, more to do. I would put it more today, a little done, a lot more to do in order to get it right, and also go out and vote yes in the same-sex marriage referendum as well in May. Thank you.
Sometimes I feel like throw my hands up in the air. I know I can count on you. Sometimes I feel like saying, Lord, I just don't care. But you've got the love I need to see me through.